Welcome to part 2 of episode 11 about identity authentication. In this video, we will demonstrate how to implement single host and multiple host port authentication on GWN switches. We will use this network configuration example to explain and configure the 3 modes of port authentication supported by GWN switches. There are 2 modes for multiple host authentication: port-based and MAC-based authentication. When port-based authentication is enabled, multiple hosts can connect to a single switch port. With this mode, only one of the connected devices needs to successfully authenticate for the switch port to authorize network access to all the devices connected to the same switch port. In this example, once the IP phone successfully authenticates on the switch port, the computer will also have access to the network without the need to authenticate. This mode is generally used for such a configuration or when an access point is plugged into the switch port. In contrast, MAC-based mode requires each connected device to individually authenticate before it is granted access to the network. In this configuration example, both the IP phone and the computer must successfully authenticate based on the supported authentication method. As shown in this example, a single port can be configured with multiple authentication methods. In single user mode, only one device can authenticate and be authorized on a single switch port. If an authenticated device is replaced with another device, the switch shuts down the port and changes the port state to unauthorized. The new device will need to successfully authenticate before it is granted access to the network. To set up this network configuration example, we will use the web interface of the switch. We start with the user port-based authentication method where only the IP phone is configured with .1x identity credentials. Please refer to part 1 of this episode that shows how to configure an IP phone with .1x authentication. Go to Identity Authentication. Under Port Mode, enable 802.1x authentication and save. Locate the switch port connecting the IP phone and the computer and click Edit. Set user authentication mode to port-based. Next, define the authentication type that will be used by the switch port. In our configuration example, the IP phone is configured with .1x identity credentials. Select Radius. After you configure the user authentication mode and the authentication type, you need to set the port control to Auto. Using this configuration for port-based authentication, only one device needs to successfully authenticate for the switch port to grant network access to all connected devices on a single port. Always use the Authentication Sessions page to verify and confirm the port status and other related information. MAC-based authentication mode can also be used to authenticate multiple devices on a single port. While port-based mode requires only one device to authenticate on a single port, MAC-based mode requires that each connected device be individually authenticated before it is granted access to the network. Using this configuration example, the IP phone and the computer must be individually authenticated using one of the supported authentication types enabled on the switch port. We will use MAC authentication in this example, so make sure it is enabled. Select and edit the switch port used by the IP phone and the computer. By default, user authentication mode is set to MAC-based. For this configuration, you need to enable 2 types of MAC authentication: .1x using a Radius authentication server and local user MAC authentication. You can also use this type of configuration for failover purposes. If the Radius server is offline, the switch will use its local database of user MAC addresses to authenticate devices. The MAC addresses can be added locally under Local User of MAC-based tab. This can be configured to allow devices to connect to a network by verifying their MAC address instead of requiring identity credentials. It could be used as an authentication database if a Radius authentication server is not deployed. Click Add and enter the IP phone's MAC address. Set port control to force authorized to grant access to the defined MAC address without authentication. Force unauthorized can be selected if a MAC address is not allowed to access the network. Define the VLAN ID that will be assigned to the device with the MAC address. And save the change. Next, we set the port control to Auto. You can also define the max number of devices that can connect to this switch port. The third user authentication method in this network configuration is single user mode. In this mode, only one device can be authenticated and granted network access on a single port. If a device is unplugged or replaced with another device, the switch port will return to the unauthorized state and the new device will need to go through the authentication process. In this example, the switch port must be configured with single user mode using the local MAC authentication. Select and edit the switch port used by the printer. Set the user authentication mode to single user and select the local MAC authentication. Next, go to local user of MAC based and enter the printer MAC address and the assigned VLAN. We set the port control to auto. This concludes today's video about implementing single host and multiple host user identity authentication. In part 3 of this episode, we will show you how to use identity authentication with VLAN and explain the associated advanced parameters.